So, we got the latest inflation data today. Yay! I just want to run through it with you quickly. And this will probably be the last time that I do this, but I'll tell you why at the end of the video. So, the headline. UK inflation falls to 3.4%, which is the lowest in more than 2 years. And that's great news. So Jeremy Hunt has come out and proclaimed,
"We are firmly on track to bring inflation down to its target 2%.
But headlines are just that. So I want to give you some of the underlying numbers today. Let's start with some of the big movers, shall we? Most notably, we have a big drop in the rate of increase of food prices,
which was nearly 20% a year ago, is now just 5%.
So, that's just a 5% increase on top of the 20% increase that we saw in prices the year before. Remember, inflation is compounding. So the price of a tin of beans, say, went up by 20%, and then they've gone up another 5% on top of that. Your shopping basket continues to get more expensive after seeing double-digit growth for an extended period of time. It is good news that the growth rate is slowing, but
just 5%.
It's still nearly 3 times the Bank of England's target of 2%. Another noticeable decline is the price of energy. You can see here that energy, gas and other fuels are having a deflationary effect on the overall headline rate. They are actually getting cheaper. And from April 1st, the average energy bill is set to fall by another 12% across the country for those on standard price cap tariffs. I've linked an article below for you that looks to answer the question of if you should be fixing rates now going forward, so yeah, check that out. But this decline in energy prices that we've seen and that we will see will continue to feed into the inflation numbers going forwards. It brings down the headline rate, which is why the Bank of England really has been so confident that inflation would fall now. I'm going to sound like a broken record here. Food and energy price inflation were always going to come down at some point. The cause of inflation in these categories is often external factors, things not relating to the UK. Jeremy here, in a way, is taking credit for the decline in food price growth.
Difficult decisions the government has taken over the last year are paying off.
But if anything, it's the actions of the Bank of England who look to influence inflation, namely through rising interest rates. This increasing of rates encourages people to save, so they stop spending, but it also makes the cost of borrowing more expensive. Mortgages, loans, student finance, everything costs more to service, which takes money out of people's pockets and reduces their spending. But 2 areas that are tricky to cut back on meaningfully are, well, you guessed it, food and energy costs. Of course, it's possible to cut back on these areas within reason, but sitting in a cold, dark house and not eating anything is just not practical for most people. People need to buy food and they need to heat their homes. The impact of interest rate rises on food and energy is up for debate. Really, I would say that the interest rate rises from the Bank of England are a blunt tool to tackle the inflation problem. And what the Bank of England will really be focusing on is not decreasing food prices, but so-called core inflation. So I think that we should look at the same thing. Looking at these numbers, it's the service-based inflation that continues to be a concern. It just seems to be stuck at around 6%, which is 3 times higher than the target of 2%. The UK is a service-based economy. The main thing we do is produce services, financial services, legal services, that sort of thing. 80% of our national output is services. So really, it's this service inflation, the rate at which these services we all use daily are increasing, that speaks to the true inflation story in the UK. Now, you would hope as people have less money because of the rising interest rates that they spend less money on these services. But when all the quick wins are done, when energy prices have finished falling in price, dragging down the overall inflation number, if we're just left with service inflation at 6%, that is honestly not good news. So one of the ways that the Bank of England measures if service inflation is likely to improve is through wage growth. The key cost of a service-based business is the wages of the staff that provide those services. I think in the context of the last decade, workers were really overdue real terms pay rises. This is a little segue, but I think this chart demonstrates this point really well. And I just want to spend a moment going over this so we can see the trend in wage growth and then what that means for service-based inflation. So you have 2 lines here that represent total pay and regular pay, the blue lines. Regular pay just excludes bonuses, and then you have the same measures adjusted for inflation to give you real wage growth, both with and without bonuses. Anytime the red and yellow line fall below the 0 here, that means the average worker is getting poorer as inflation is outstripping their wage growth. So you can see after 2008, there was this large stretch of negative real wage growth. We see brief spikes in people getting better off in real terms, but that didn't really make up for this massive wage stagnation here. The recent wage growth here looks significant, doesn't it? But then take it in the context of the sky-high inflation rates, and again, we see wages growing at record levels, but people are still getting poorer. Only recently has this trend gone positive, where people today are actually getting better off as a result of wage growth. But this right here clearly doesn't make up for all of this. In this context, the Bank of England's not going to concern themselves with this long-term trend. They'll just be saying that wage growth right now is an indicator of service-based inflation. Their argument is that in order to cope with increasing wage costs, service businesses will put their prices up and we get a wage price spiral, as they call it. I prefer to call it a price wage spiral just because prices went up first and people asked for more wages, rightfully so. I don't think wage price, implying that the wages went up first, is a fair description of what's going on in today's economy. But on the 1st of April, we will see a rise in minimum wage in the UK. And this is obviously a growth in wages. It's important that I say I don't think people shouldn't be getting pay rises. Far from it. I just want to point out, though, that the service component of the inflation data is still persistent. And if wage growth is feeding into that, well, about 5% of the UK workforce are about to get a pay rise on April 1st. I just think this point speaks to the fact that, we're kind of far from out the woods yet with the service component. And really, the overall inflation rate is being flattered by steep declines in areas that were previously increasing at sky-high rates. Jeremy said this in his interview.
As inflation gets closer to its target, that opens the door for the Bank of England to consider bringing down interest rates.
But the Bank of England in their monetary policy report states this: we will keep interest rates high for long enough to get inflation back to the 2% target in a lasting way. So the service numbers at 6% are a long way off the goal of 2%, aren't they? And at the current rate of decline, it's going to take 3 years to hit the target. So while it's constantly teased by the media and by Jeremy Hunt that we might see a drop in rates, I would be surprised if they did personally. I mean, never say never. The Bank of England was late to show up to the inflation party. Maybe they'll be the first to leave and, claim it's all over. But let's say they stick with their messaging of we won't drop rates until we're sustainably at 2%. And then in line with their own forecast that inflation will fall initially as food and energy growth decreases, but then spike again towards the end of the year. I just can't see how they're going to drop the rates. And I think this from Jeremy.
As inflation gets closer to its target, that opens the door for the Bank of England to consider bringing down interest rates. That brings down mortgage rates.
It's a sort of false hope designed to win votes. Rates will stay at elevated levels. And even when they do come down, if they do, which I think they will eventually, but maybe not now, it's still going to be higher than what we got used to over the last decade, which were historically low rates. The impact of this is the next area that we need to focus on. It's something, again, that we've spoken about time and time again on this channel. Francis Bacon once said, the remedy is worse than the disease. A guy called William Osler said something different, something like, the person who takes the medicine must recover twice, once from the disease and once from the medicine. Within the data that makes up the inflation figures, we see the impacts of the medicine punishing the UK population. If the disease was rampant inflation causing sky-high prices, the cure for that was higher interest rates, and the side effects of that cure, the result of borrowing costs increasing, is clear to see in the owner-occupier housing cost section of the inflation data. You can see it plain as day here. As the headline rate of inflation falls, the owner-occupier housing cost element keeps rising, which is now sitting at about 6%. This is basically the cost of owning and occupying your own home. A 6% increase in the house cost is far more impactful than, say, a 6% increase in the cost of furniture or communication. This line right here reflects the reality for millions of homeowners across the UK who are coming off fixed-rate deals, entering into much more expensive mortgages. It's this sort of madness that the side effect of the cure of inflation is now one of the leading causes of inflation. But this line isn't even an accurate depiction of what's really going on. For those impacted, it's not a 6% increase, it's a doubling of the cost of your mortgage. This effect really is by design, as in this is what the Bank of England is looking to achieve by increasing interest rates. But that doesn't mean I'm going to sit here and say, well, these people should have seen it coming, they shouldn't have purchased an expensive home. In the same way, I won't sit here and say to you that a 5% increase in your food costs is good because it's not 20% a year anymore. I know a load of mortgage-free homeowners are sat there sheltered from this. But the reality in the UK is millions of Brits, due to a housing crisis, were forced to borrow large amounts in order to get on the ladder. And now they're seeing the debt cost burden of that property skyrocket. And for people sat there going, well, this only mortgage holders and only a third of homes are affected by this. No, this problem affects a lot more people than that. This chart demonstrates that as owner-occupier housing costs rise, rents go with them. This effect is being felt by the majority of the UK population. So I find Jeremy's remarks here.
That opens the door for the Bank of England to consider bringing down interest rates. That brings down mortgage rates. That makes a very big difference.
Just a little bit insensitive to the plight of millions of people. Because sitting there saying, oh, because your food bill is now going up less a year than it was last year, and because energy continues to fall in price, the Bank of England can now maybe start to consider if they would like to reduce interest rates. I hope I've shown you today that really it's the service numbers that are the key to this. And as they're not budging, I would just be shocked to see rates decline meaningfully. I think this is going to be the last time that I cover this inflation story on the channel in a video like this. I can do community posts if you want on the channel updating you on the figures, and I'll also write about it in my newsletter. I'll leave a link below if you want to sign up to that. But for 2 years now, I've sat here saying core inflation is a concern, and that still remains the case. Now, I don't want to be a negative force in the finance world. I want to make you feel good about your finances and then about your life. Because, look at the last couple of years, all the fear-mongering, all the doubt, all the doom on YouTube and in the media. And if you'd just ignored all of it and invested consistently in a low-cost index fund, which I hope you did, you'd be better off today than you were back then. Pessimists sound smart, optimists make money. I do think it's really important that I use this platform to acknowledge how difficult it is for people at the moment, while I also look to cut through a lot of the BS that we see from politicians and mainstream media. But I'm just not sure what else I can say on this inflation story that isn't me hammering home the same thing every single month. And I'm not sure what good that does you as a viewer of the video. So yeah, let me know below what you think. I read every comment that everyone posts and I value your input. Should we just move this to community posts and the newsletter and, crack on with our lives with more positive videos? Speaking of cracking on with our lives, I'm off to watch Dune 2 tonight. I can't wait. But I know full well, as I'll be sat there watching Paul Atreides battle House Harkonnen for control of the spice fields of Arrakis, I'll be sitting there thinking, this is all lovely, Paul, but have you seen the core inflation numbers?